Welcome to Nice and Blunt. My name is Adam Riancho, and today it's time for another rankings video, but we're pivoting to the tight end position this time. I'm going to give you my top 10 for 2024. We're at number 1. I have a tier of 5 that I think you can argue all deserve to be ranked at the top. But personally, I've got Sam LaPorta as the best option this year. LaPorta of the Detroit Lions finished his rookie season as the tight end 1 in total scoring last year, but on a per game basis was tied for third with Mark Andrews, averaging 11.3 points per game on the back of 10 touchdowns, which led the position across the board. No other tight end scored more than 6 touchdowns last year, so it was a pretty big gap between him and the next best guy. And on top of that, he was just a rookie. It was very impressive. Double-digit touchdowns is a stat, though, that's kind of difficult for most offensive players to repeat. However, the Detroit offense spreads the ball around very evenly in the red zone. There were 4 players for the Lions that scored between 10 and 13 touchdowns last season. And given their situation is almost identical this year, I expect that to repeat. So I think it's reasonable for him to maintain this production. He's only 23 years old, so injury risk is very minimal, especially compared to Travis Kelce at 35. And in year 2 in the league, it's safe to assume that his target share will be increasing. The Lions didn't draft a single receiving threat in this year's draft, so LaPorta is locked in to remaining the number 2 target for Jared Goff. There is a lot of hype surrounding Jameson Williams, and he is expected to have a breakout season, but he's not going to overtake LaPorta. I would be shocked if that happened. Last year, LaPorta had 120 targets. I expect that number to increase because they let go of Marvin Jones. He retired, as well as Josh Reynolds in free agency. He's now a Denver Bronco, and that frees up a total 74 targets in this offense. So most of those are definitely going to Jameson Williams, but there are a few that should be in line to go towards Sam LaPorta next season. So I think there's a reasonable expectation of possibly 140 targets in line for him this year. And there's literally no red flags that I can think of. If you are going to rank anyone above Travis Kelce this year, I think it should be Sam LaPorta. I don't think you can argue for anyone else. And on Underdog, at least, that is where his ADP does suggest he should be drafted. He's going off the board as tight end 1, pick 36 overall. I do think it is justified. At number 2, though, this is the lowest I can rank Travis Kelce. He's still Travis Kelce, but he was not as dominant at the tight end position last year. He did rank first at the position in points per game, but he also missed 2 games in week 1. He also sat out week 18, and that's why LaPorta was able to outscore him on the season. I would expect him to keep up his dominance, though, and maintain the status as the alpha in the Chiefs offense. But I think just like last year, compared to other tight ends, he's not going to be like 4 points per game better than any other option. So that's why he's not going in round 1 anymore. He's now coming off the board in round 4. He is tight end 2, pick 38 overall on Underdog, and I'm fine drafting him there, but I'm a bit underweight purely on roster construction reasons. I often go with either quarterback or wide receiver at the top of the 4th round instead, but he's still definitely Mahomes' favorite target. He was elite in the playoffs. He was unguardable still, and he can still crush any given week. He can put up over 30 points. You would not be shocked, especially if it's against like the Chargers, for instance. But they did really ease up on his volume in December last year as they prepped for the Super Bowl, and I would expect that to happen again. He's a year older, so there's no reason to force the issue with him, especially with an upgraded wide receiver core. I think they want to take the load off of Kelce so that he is 100% going into the actual playoffs in January. So his fantasy playoff profile might not be league winning like it wasn't last year. He didn't score a single touchdown in his final 6 games, an average of 8.1 half PPR points per game. But if you look even closer, specifically in the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15, 16, 17, he was terrible. In those final 3 games, he only averaged 5.1 points per game, not a single touchdown, only 4.3 receptions per game for 29 yards per game. That was atrocious. You lost your league if you were starting Kelce in the fantasy playoffs. That and his age are legitimately the only red flags that you can point to, though, when it comes to Travis Kelce. He will be turning 35 in October, but we've seen the tight end position be a lot less affected by age historically, especially compared to wide receiver and running back. So I don't think it's enough to scare me away. I just don't think he's the overwhelming tight end one anymore. This top tier that I'm ranking is made up of 5 different players, and I think you can pivot to a younger player and feel fine about it, but he's still Kelce, and for some reason, that Taylor Swift bump appears to be a legitimate thing. He does play a lot better when she is in the stadium, so maybe you want to lean into it, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. He also still gets 2 games every year against the Chargers. He literally owns the Chargers on the field. So there's not much to worry about with Kelce, but if you do want to bump him down because of the age and injury concerns, especially that fantasy playoff production, I understand, but this is the lowest I can go at number 2. I'm still drafting Travis Kelce when I can. But number 3 is a player I'm calling my bet on. This ranking could come back to haunt me, but at tight end 3, I have Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. When you draft Kincaid this high, there are definitely several assumptions that need to happen in order for him to pay off. But I think it's a worthwhile bet. The absence of Stephon Diggs, Gabe Davis make the new bevy of receivers very unproven, and collectively there are 284 available targets from last season, along with 22 vacated touchdowns in the Bills offense from 2023. And with his first round draft capital, it's safe to assume that the Bills are most invested in Kincaid's success. I think he is clearly going to be the number 1 target for Josh Allen this year. Overall, Kincaid is the most trustworthy week to week. And if we look back to his usage last year, there was a 6-game sample size in his rookie season where we got a glimpse of what to expect from Kincaid in an elevated role. From weeks 7 through 12, Dawson Knox was either hurt mid-game or off the field entirely, and Kincaid was phenomenal in this sample size. Without Knox, Kincaid averaged 11.2 points per game on 7.5 targets per game, 6.5 receptions per game, 59 yards per game, and scored 2 touchdowns. His catch percentage was why he was so trustworthy. It was 86.7%. He was a security blanket for Josh Allen in the passing game. This catch percentage is why I'm so confident that Kincaid is at the very least going to replicate this volume, if not exceed it this year. And with 22 touchdowns up for grabs, I would expect his per game average of 0.33 touchdowns per game to increase as well. I think at least 8 touchdowns, 0.5 per game feels appropriate coming up next season. And that means 11.2 points per game, what he put up in that 6-game sample size, is going to be his floor projection for me in 2024. That would have ranked as tight end 5 on a per game basis last year. So if the volume and touchdowns increase, then Kincaid is one of the few players I can actually envision finishing the year as tight end 1. And with all the volume available in Buffalo, it feels like a very reasonable bet to make that he can do that. His ADP is still a value despite rising to pick 51 overall. He's going off the board as tight end 5 on Underdog, and to get him in the 5th round in the same range as guys like Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, Hollywood Brown feels like a smash pick. I would much rather draft Kincaid than a wide receiver at the top of round 5. So you're drafting him at his floor at this price, and if the touchdowns do jump to 10 plus on the year, he could be a league winner. I do want to bring up some risk, though, with Kincaid. When Knox returned to the lineup with new offensive coordinator Joe Brady, there was a 3-game sample size where they just didn't know how to use him, and there was a lot of growing pains. Post-bye, weeks 14, 15, 16, Kincaid averaged 4 targets per game, 2 receptions per game for 9 yards. His depth of target was basically behind the line of scrimmage. He scored 0 touchdowns in those 3 weeks. So if you started him in the fantasy playoffs, he likely cost you your wild card matchup. With an average of 1.9 points per game, he was absolute shit. He put up a bagel in week 15 versus Dallas. So that's the only concern I have. There is a big red flag that you can point to, but the reason why I'm not reading into it personally is because he did massively bounce back in the final 2 games. In weeks 17 and 18, the Bills course corrected and he went over 80 yards in both games, averaging that 7.5 targets per game once again, along with 5.5 receptions, an average of 11.3 points per game without scoring a touchdown. So an excellent floor. He was phenomenal. And in those 2 playoff games as well, he averaged 10.2 points per game for fantasy. He was perfectly fine. It's emblematic of what you're going to get from him next season. At the worst, I think there is a chance it goes massively up because there's just so many targets available in Buffalo. So you're locked into top 5 production. There's a chance he's the best tight end overall. Kincaid is my tight end 3. Draft him as much as you can. At number 4, though, I have Mark Andrews of the Baltimore Ravens. And the case for drafting Mark Andrews is pretty simple. You either think the leg injury that forced him to miss 7 games last year is going to be a hindrance this season, or you don't. You either care about it or you have no concerns at all. He turns 29 in September, and I am on the side that it is not going to have any effect on his fantasy production this season. Other than that, there's very minor red flags that you can give Mark Andrews. The Ravens offense is a run-first scheme, but it's been that way for a while. It hasn't impacted him at all. And while they did replace Gus Edwards with Derrick Henry, maybe there's a few less red zone opportunities, but Gus still scored 13 touchdowns last year. It's not like that is a big deal. It's probably going to be similar with Henry, maybe 13, 15. I doubt it'll be 20 plus for the veteran. So I think that's a wash, but Zay Flowers does enter year 2 and should get an uptick in volume most likely. But Odell Beckham Jr. also left the team, freeing up 64 targets to go around. And they replaced him with just a 4th-round rookie wide receiver, Devontae Walker, who I think is more of a project long-term. He might be a threat, but in year 1, I'm not worried about Walker. So that shouldn't matter at all either. And besides, if you look at the games where Andrews was healthy last season, Flowers was pretty bad. He only scored 1 touchdown in those 10 games. Maybe you believe some of the camp hype for Rashad Bateman, but I'm not worried about it at all. The only remaining variable would be if 3rd-year tight end Isaiah Likely played well enough in Andrews' absence last year to merit more of a role going forward. Likely was exceptional while filling in, so honestly that's my biggest concern this season. But even if he does get on the field more, I think we would just see more 2 tight end sets, not less snaps overall for Andrews. So I don't really care. Even if he has to share the ball a little bit more this season, I don't think it's to a point where I'm all of a sudden lowering my expectations for Mark Andrews. He was tied with Sam LaPorta for tight end 3 last year with 11.3 points per game. He was getting 6.1 targets per game, 4.5 receptions per game for 74 yards per game. He also scored 6 touchdowns in 10 games, and he missed week 1 and only played 7 snaps in week 11 versus Cincinnati's. So if you remove that Bengals game where he got hurt, his average actually jumped to 12.2 points per game in 9 full healthy games, and that would have actually ranked as tight end 1 on a per game basis last year. So if you pace out his production in those 9 healthy games, he was expected to score 11 touchdowns last year, which also would have led the position. And touchdowns are a big staple of his game. They have been consistently high year over year. Since 2019, his year 2 breakout, Mark Andrews has scored 37 touchdowns in 71 games. And on a per 17 game pace, that is an average of 9 touchdowns every year. So he's one of the safest tight ends that you can draft. And that's why he's still in my top tier at the position, despite ranking number 4 for me. The elite guys this year all kind of feel the same, and I don't think you're getting a massive difference between number 1 and number 5. At number 4, Andrews is still elite. If injuries are not a factor again this season, then you can make a very strong case that he should be ranked number 1. So go ahead and take him there if that's who you want. I think he's a home run pick with his current ADP of tight end 4, pick 48 overall, and he also lines up perfectly to stack him up with Lamar Jackson at that 4-5 turn on Underdog. I think that's one of the best investments that you can get in terms of stacking options next year. So that feels like such a lock to pay off. It's not even fair. I'm actually overweight on Andrews. I have him at 10%, despite ranking Kincaid 1 spot higher, and Kincaid is going even later. I honestly wish I had more of him. He's just such a bust-proof pick. You should 100% be drafting him above wide receivers like Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, and Hollywood Brown as well. He's a steal in drafts right now, and for some reason that just hasn't changed all offseason. Go ahead and take him as much as you want. But at number 5, the final player I have in this elite tier at tight end is Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals, and he was extremely dominant in the Arizona offense once Zach Ertz left the team. In those final 10 games, he was clearly the number one target in Arizona. He averaged 11.7 half PPR points per game on 8.5 targets per game, 6.6 receptions per game, 78 yards per game, and scored 3 touchdowns. Surprisingly, his numbers actually took a slight dip when Kyler Murray was the quarterback. If we isolate those 8 games, his average falls to 11.5 points per game, but it's basically identical. It's not that big of a difference with or without Kyler. And 11.5 points per game did rank as tight end 3 on a per game basis last year. His touchdown rate was kind of low, only on pace for 4 total touchdowns in 17 games. So if we do see those touchdowns increase, there's a legitimate case that McBride can also finish this year as the tight end 1 overall. And it's why, despite ranking him 5th, I still have him in the top tier. I think you're getting a great player no matter what if you have any of these top 5 options at tight end. I think you can legitimately argue for any of them as number 1, but the reason I have him last in this tier is because, unlike Dalton Kincaid, it is hard to imagine that his target share increases this season, because Arizona drafted superstar rookie wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. with the 4th overall pick in the draft. And even though we've never seen him play on the field, I think his talent will come as advertised. I think Marvin Harrison is a true alpha, and that is a massive upgrade over Marquise Hollywood Brown, who was their best receiver last season. So when it comes to target competition, I do think it's a lot more interesting this year. I don't think it will impact him that much because they do play very different roles, but I think it's safe to assume that Harrison will see the most targets from Kyler Murray, and that means McBride's pace of 8.5 targets per game likely does decrease a little bit. Michael Wilson, Zay Jones, and Greg Dulcich, though, are the only other receivers on this team, and I don't feel like they're legitimate threats to impact him at all. So I think he's perfectly fine, justified to draft where he's going, but you never know. He could dip to about 7 targets per game, which could put him on pace for 120 over 17 games. That's still plenty to offer high-end numbers at the tight end position, but he might be on the lower end of the spectrum. That's why I rank him at number 5. For those reasons, I think he has a high enough floor to warrant his ADP. On Underdog, he is being drafted as tight end 3, pick 46 overall. I think that's a perfectly fair price, but I do prefer Kincaid and Andrews simply because I envision higher touchdown upside for them, and that's why I take McBride a little bit less than average. I prefer to take him when he falls to me in round 5 rather than scoop him up at the end of the 4th. So it's really not a big deal. It's kind of just who do you want. If you prefer McBride over those other 2, or even at number 1, I understand. I think you're fine to do that. After all, he is still in my top tier at the position. I just have him at the bottom as opposed to the top. Moving on, though, to tight end 6, we enter a new tier where I still think you can make the case these players are league winners in their own right, and it wouldn't shock me at all if they do finish inside the top 3 next season, but I think it's really hard to make the case that they are indeed the tight end 1 next year. At number 6, I have George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers, who's still a force to be reckoned with. As we saw against Dallas last season, he scored 3 touchdowns on only 3 catches the night before his 30th birthday. And aside from an injury in the Super Bowl, nothing slowed him down at all. He enters his 8th NFL season in a crowded offense, however. The Niners feel like they're going to make one last run at the Super Bowl with this roster before they have to pay Brock Purdy and likely make some big budget cuts next season. So there's still a slight chance that Brandon Ayuk does get traded before the deadline, in which case Kittle would be a massive value at tight end 7 off the board, but probably by the time I post this video and by the time you watch it, I wouldn't be shocked at all if Ayuk did sign an extension to stay in San Francisco. So I don't think much is going to change for Kittle next season. I don't see his volume going up. But if Ayuk were to get traded, then he would be a league-winning value at tight end 7 off the board, pick 65 overall on Underdog. But even if that doesn't happen, he's still being drafted at his floor. Last year, he was tight end 5 on a per-game basis with an average 10.5 points per game, and he was the only tight end in the NFL last year to go over 1,000 receiving yards. What's even more impressive was how efficient he was in order to do that. He caught just 65 catches on only 90 targets and also scored 6 touchdowns in 16 games. To put that in context, Travis Kelce had only 984 yards on a total 121 targets, 93 catches. Kelce had more catches last year than Kittle had targets. So Kittle has proven that he can do more with less. His 15.7 yards per catch average was by far the highest at the tight end position. The next highest rate would have been Isaiah Likely, who had an average 13.7 yards per reception. But as impressive as it is, it does highlight the fact that his volume is a slight red flag. Kittle had fewer targets per game than even Dalton Schultz last year, and if you remove the 3 touchdown game versus Dallas, he only scored 3 touchdowns in the other 15 games. So while he is hyper efficient and can go over 100 yards on just 3 catches any given week, he can also follow that up the following game for 3 catches and less than 30 yards, which is what happened 6 times last season. He was a lot more volatile than the other guys above him. He was definitely a more boom bust option. When he goes off, he's still elite, but when it doesn't happen, sometimes you barely get 5 points. And with the 49ers likely going to try to keep Brandon Ayuk happy this year, I would expect to see Kittle's target share likely decrease just a little bit rather than go up. But at the end of the day, he still plays for Kyle Shanahan and can put up the highest fantasy numbers at the position in any given game. The only reason I do not have him in the top tier is because of the volume and consistency concerns, given he is most likely the number 4 target on his offense. Everyone else I have ranked higher on the list is at worst number 2 in receiving on their team. But you never know, there could be an injury to CMC, Debo, or Ayuk this year that vaults him back up these rankings. I doubt one of them gets traded, but it is still possible. At number 7, though, I have Evan Engram of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who is kind of hard to rank, honestly, because unlike George Kittle, volume is nowhere near a concern for him. He led all tight ends in both targets and catches last season with a total 143 targets, 114 catches in 17 games. Forget tight ends. He finished 12th in targets across the league and 4th in receptions among all NFL players last season. He was a beast for the Jags. Despite these impressive numbers, though, he only finished as tight end 6 in points per game with 10.4 on average. He gave you 8.4 targets per game, 6.7 receptions per game, 57 yards per game on an 80% catch percentage. He was a safety net for Trevor Lawrence. But what really held him back was his touchdown production. He scored only 4 touchdowns all year, despite his massive volume. And what's even more concerning is that all 4 of those touchdowns came in the final 6 games, only once Christian Kirk was off the field with injury. In that 6-game sample size, his targets jumped to 10.2 per game, and he turned it into 8.3 catches for 73 yards per game and 15.5 fantasy points per game in half PPR. He was a league winner at the end of the season. But what's so disappointing about that fact is that if you look at the first 11 games when Christian Kirk was healthy, he was not that good. His fantasy points fell to only 7.7 points per game on average, and that ranked as tight end 13 in points per game last season. So it was really a tale of 2 seasons. You got barely a starting option most games, but with a very high floor. And then at the end of the year, when you may have possibly moved off of him or lost a lot of confidence, all of a sudden he was dominant, and you may have benched him in one of those random games, because tight end 13 is not an automatic lock in your lineup. So despite elite volume and consistency, Evan Engram felt like a massive disappointment if you had him in the first 3 months of the year. On the bright side, he's entering just his age 30 season with 2 years left on his contract. He's the 6th highest paid tight end in the NFL at an average $13.75 million per year. And Jacksonville did move on from Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, as well as Jamal Agnew in free agency, and that opens up a combined 221 targets available from last season. They did bring in wide receiver Gabe Davis, as well as drafted rookie wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. with pick 23 overall, but Trevor Lawrence is healthy coming into the year, but so is Christian Kirk. And despite so much volume up for grabs, it's hard to imagine that Engram increases the 143 targets that he saw last season. So I do expect that number to come down. That being said, I do see more of a positive touchdown regression also coming for him, and that's probably going to even out overall. He proved that he's a safety blanket for Trevor Lawrence, and Doug Peterson likely rewards him this year with several more red zone opportunities. I doubt he's going to go without a touchdown again this year if Christian Kirk stays healthy. So on one hand, Engram may revert to barely putting up top 12 numbers at the position again, but on the other hand, he likely gives you a weekly floor of at least 7.5 points, and if the touchdown does hit, now you're looking at 13.5. That is definitely some top 5 upside looming for Engram next season. So I think he's a safe, reliable option at the tight end position. I don't think you're going to make anyone jealous when you draft him. But barring an injury, you have a bust-proof selection. I don't think he's going to be the reason why you lose your league either. With a 7th round underdog ADP of tight end 8, pick 76 overall, he allows you to stay competitive at the position while also drafting elite weapons throughout the first 6 rounds on your roster. And I'm happy to draft him if I missed out on the top 6 guys. I think he's a perfectly fine pick in the 7th round. But honestly, the biggest reason why I'm not drafting a ton of Kittle, Pitts, or Engram this year is because my tight end 8 is often drafted a full round or 2 later, and he's my favorite tight end this year. It's Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. Last year, Ferguson stepped in very nicely for Dalton Schultz in this offense, and going into year 3 as a pro, I don't think the situation could be better. CeeDee Lamb is the clear alpha number 1 wide receiver and target in Dallas. No one is questioning that, but he's currently holding out for a new contract, and that means in training camp, Jake Ferguson is the best weapon they have and is about to set up elite chemistry with all of those reps going into week 1 this season. The only quasi-legitimate threat for targets in this offense would be Brandon Cooks otherwise, and he is an aging veteran who enters his 11th season in the NFL this year and is going to turn 31 years old in September. Cooks has seen a dip in volume over each of the last 2 seasons as well, maxing out at 81 targets in 16 games last season. And Ferguson, meanwhile, has already overtaken him in the target share. He had 102 targets last year. However, Cooks was still favored in the red zone. He scored 8 touchdowns in 2023. Meanwhile, Ferguson only scored 5, and I could easily see those numbers flipping between the 2 players. So combined with an overall uptick in volume for Ferguson, I think it's reasonable to project 120 targets, if not more, for him this year. I think 80 plus catches and roughly 900 yards, assuming his catch percentage and yards per catch average stay the same. And if the touchdowns do swap between him and Brandon Cooks, and he does score 8 next season, that's an average of 10.5 points per game, which last year ranked as tight end 6 on a per game basis. So that would be just behind George Kittle, who scored 10.7. And I understand if you think this projection is a bit too optimistic, it's definitely not guaranteed, but that's why I'm including Ferguson in this tier 6, 7, and 8. I view identically. He can realistically finish even higher inside the top 5 with just a few minor changes in the Dallas offense shifting in his favor. And I really think it's going to happen. If you told me that Dallas had added a legit wide receiver in free agency, I wouldn't be this confident, but they didn't. If you told me that they drafted a receiver in the 2nd round, I'd be less confident as well, but they got sniped by 4 picks on A.D. Mitchell. They took an edge rusher, Marshawn Kneeland, instead, and they let Malachi Corley, Jermaine Burton, Roman Wilson all fall to the 3rd round, and even in round 3, they passed on Jalen McMillan. At pick 87, they instead drafted a linebacker out of Notre Dame. They didn't have a 4th round pick. They also passed on receiver in the 5th, and they settled on Ryan Flournoy out of Southeast Missouri State in round 6, someone I had not heard of entering the draft. Maybe he's good. Maybe Jalen Brooks and Kamonte Turpin can step up, but I really have no confidence that anyone other than Lamb is a real threat to Ferguson's volume. I do think he's going to see at least 120 targets this season. And the Cowboys were the highest scoring offense in the NFL last year, and they also replaced Tony Pollard in the backfield with 29-year-old Ezekiel Elliott. They also let Michael Gallup walk in free agency, and between him and Pollard, there's 124 targets up for grabs from last year. Ferguson is an extremely safe pick on Underdog. He's being drafted as tight end 9, pick 84 overall, but I vehemently believe he should be drafted a full round higher, and occasionally he falls to me at the end of the 8th round, pick 95 sometimes, and I will eat that up all day long if I can get it. But even if he doesn't fall at tight end 9, you are drafting him at his floor. That's exactly what he did last season. He was tied with Trey McBride for tight end 9 on a per game basis last year. He averaged 8.3 points per game. But if you know anything about the Cowboys in fantasy last season, you know that they were a far superior team after the week 7 bye. Their offense clicked. And in the first year with Mike McCarthy, it made sense that they needed that bye week to figure things out. In those final 11 games, Dak Prescott was an MVP candidate. CeeDee Lamb averaged 24 fantasy points per game. Brandon Cooks scored all 8 of his touchdowns. And Jake Ferguson played his best as well. In this 11-game sample size, post-bye, Ferguson saw 6.6 targets per game, caught 4.5 receptions per game for 52 yards per game, and scored 4 touchdowns. He averaged 9.6 points per game in half PPR, which was tight end 8 on a per game basis last year, and that is exactly where I rank him. Ferguson is the last tight end I feel legitimately competitive with as my weekly starter, and it's why he is one of my most drafted players this offseason. I love him. I think you should be targeting him in drafts this season, and the fact that he's 2 rounds cheaper than Kyle Pitts is why I am very underweight on Pitts and have Ferguson on 15% of my fantasy teams. I cannot stop drafting him, and I cannot wait for this investment to pay off. But moving on to tight end number 9, we are entering a new tier, and there is a lot of volatility and a lot that is difficult to accurately predict with these last 2 players in this video. Number 9, though, is probably the most polarizing player in all of fantasy football. It's Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons. You're either in one of 2 camps when it comes to Kyle Pitts. You're either someone who's been burned so badly by him in the past that you're disgusted at the thought of even considering to draft him, and you laugh at the other people who are willing to take him at that 5-6 turn as tight end 6, pick 60 overall on Underdog. I think he is overpriced. Or you're one of the people who is extremely excited about Kyle Pitts and you can't wait to draft him. You think that he's going as a steal at this price, and sometimes you even reach on him at the top of the 5th round or even above guys like Kincaid, Andrews, or Trey McBride. Some people really love him. Some people hate him. There is no in between. But given I have him at tight end 9, still a top 10 option, maybe I am one of those people who has a lukewarm take on Kyle Pitts. But before I list all of the reasons why you shouldn't draft him, let me first make the case for why you should. The man is a freak athlete. He was drafted 4th overall in the 2021 draft because he was considered literally the best tight end prospect that we've ever seen come out of college at the position. He is 6 foot 6 inches tall, 245 pounds with 33-inch arms, and runs a 4.49 40-yard dash that puts him in the 99th percentile when it comes to speed at the position. In his junior year of college, he caught 43 catches for 770 yards and 12 touchdowns, and he only played in 8 games as a junior at Florida. And despite being a letdown in the NFL, he is still just 23 years old. He turns 24 on October 6th, and there's still plenty of time for him to live up to the high expectations that people have, assuming he was a Hall of Fame player immediately. So it is still too soon to completely write him off. If you haven't at least gotten a little bit intrigued by all of those facts, then let's keep going. His quarterback play has also been absolute horse shit. Last year, he had the combination of Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke under center, and the year before that, it was a combination of Desmond Ridder and Marcus Mariota. This year, he gets a massive quarterback upgrade with Kirk Cousins joining the team, and if somehow the Achilles injury does crop up again or just holds Cousins back, he's not the same guy, the team does have a failsafe. They drafted Michael Penix Jr. to be the backup with this year's 8th overall pick in the draft. Cousins, I think, should be fine for at least 1 year. I think the job is his, and he is by far and away the best quarterback Pitts will get to play with in his 3-year career. And this is even an upgrade over a 36-year-old Matt Ryan, who was his quarterback in 2021, his rookie year. In case you forgot, Pitts was pretty good as a rookie. His only touchdown came in London when Calvin Ridley was inactive. That was the big red flag for Pitts that season. Only 1 touchdown, but he still caught 68 total receptions on 110 targets for 1,026 yards as well. And I literally just mentioned 5-10 minutes ago that George Kittle was the only tight end in 2023 to surpass 1,000 yards with 1,020. So Pitts literally had more receiving yards as a rookie than every single tight end did in 2023. And we know that Cousins is going to throw the ball to the tight end because when he had a good one in 18 career games with TJ Hawkinson, he threw him the ball 154 times for 113 catches, 997 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Say what you want about TJ Hawkinson. He's a very good player, but I think Kyle Pitts might be a better athlete. He's taller, he's faster, and he's also 3 years younger. So the fact that he's about to step into his prime give him a ton of legitimate reasons why you should bet on him in 2024. But now it's time for the bad news. In 44 career games, Kyle Pitts has only 6 career touchdowns. 1 as a rookie in 17 games, 2 in year 2 in only 10 games, and last year in 17 games, he scored 3 touchdowns. So he sucks in the red zone, and touchdowns are hyper critical for fantasy success at the tight end position. It can cover all of the mistakes. It can also really deplete you from that upside if they do not hit. And like I mentioned with Evan Engram, despite his volume, when he wasn't scoring touchdowns, he wasn't even a top 12 tight end on a per game basis last year. And Pitts can still give you 1,000+ yards this season, but if the touchdowns do not hit, then he's just not going to come close to paying off his tight end 6 ADP. I understand that Arthur Smith ruined him and didn't use him the right way. He sent him fewer targets per game every single year following that rookie season. And although I think that's going to fix itself to a certain extent with new offensive coordinator Zach Robinson, there is no guarantee that it's going to work out in the red zone. This is the key factor for Kyle Pitts this season. The targets and yardage should make him a top tight end in terms of floor, but unless he scores 6 or more touchdowns, you're just not going to sniff top 5 fantasy numbers, and that's why he is more likely to bust that 6th overall ADP at the position. He would have to go over 1,200 yards to compensate if he only scores another 3 touchdowns again this year, and 6 touchdowns might not sound like a lot, but only 7 players at tight end, including Taysom Hill, hit that number last year. Travis Kelce and TJ Hawkinson were not on that list. Only Sam LaPorta went over 6 touchdowns, so it was really unlikely to happen across the board. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but I just think it's unwise to bet on it. Last season, he wasn't even a top 15 tight end on a per game basis. He only averaged 6.5 points per game on 5.3 targets, 3.1 receptions per game for only 39 yards per game. And with those 3 touchdowns, he was almost unusable on a weekly basis. For some reason, he could barely beat out Jonnu Smith on the same offense in Atlanta last year. Thankfully, Jonnu Smith is gone, but it's not like I'm just like dying to draft Pitts. Like, I need to see it before I fully trust him, and I think it's a little more likely we get a breakout that's legitimate in year 2 in this offense rather than year 1 with a new offensive coordinator. So the fact that you have to draft him above players like George Kittle, Evan Engram, and even Jake Ferguson is why I'm not drafting him. I think it's inevitable that he does finally pay off, but I think this season you're going to be disappointed, and unless he falls to you at a massive discount, like by a full round, I just don't try to draft him. I think it's not really worth it. I do think next year will be better, but I think this year it's more likely he disappoints you at a pretty decent rate. But at number 9, like, he's not atrocious. I think he will be better. Just, I'm not a believer. I'm not telling you that he will win you your league in fantasy this season. Tight end 10, however, is someone I view in the exact same tier and is going several rounds later, almost 5 full rounds after Kyle Pitts. The last player I am talking about would be David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns. Njoku was a league winner in 2024, not because he was a top 5 guy all season long, but because he was essentially the tight end 1 over the final 5 games of 2023. In those 5 games, he averaged 9 targets per game, 6 receptions per game, 78 yards per game, and scored 4 touchdowns as well. He was on fire. He was giving you 15.6 points per game in half PPR. No other tight end was better in the fantasy playoffs. The only problem with these numbers, though, are the fact that Joe Flacco was his quarterback. Flacco had literally nothing to lose, and he was slinging it all over the field, and Njoku was arguably his favorite target. Now, sadly, Flacco is the backup quarterback in Indianapolis behind Anthony Richardson. So now we're looking at Jameis Winston as the backup plan. We are back to the Deshaun Watson experience in Cleveland, hoping for the best. And that's the horrible news for Njoku by comparison. In the 5 games last year, when Deshaun Watson was healthy, Njoku's numbers plummeted to only 6.7 fantasy points per game. He averaged only 5.2 targets per game, 4 catches per game for 35 yards per game, and scored just 1 touchdown with Deshaun Watson. So instead of the tight end 1 on a per game basis with Flacco, Njoku was the tight end 17 in games with Deshaun Watson, and he was just as bad as Kyle Pitts was last season with Desmond Ridder. So a massive, massive gap in ceiling as opposed to floor. And it's not like this trend of Njoku taking a big hit in fantasy production is relevant only when you look at Joe Flacco. Njoku played 6 other games last year with 3 other backup quarterbacks. PJ Walker, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, and Brandon Allen also got snaps at QB. And in those 6 games, Njoku was pretty legit. He was a top 10 option. He averaged 8.9 points per game, and these 11 games without Deshaun Watson are the main reason why he finished 2023 as the tight end 7 in points per game with an average 10.3 overall. I genuinely want to rank Njoku higher. I do believe in his talent. I like him a lot, and so do the Browns. He's actually the 7th highest paid tight end in all of the NFL. He's under contract for 2 more years at an average $13.7 million per year. He just turned 28. He's still in his prime, and he proved last season he has the explosiveness to score from anywhere on the field. I think him and Kyle Pitts are 2 of the most unpredictable players at tight end this year. They could both win you the league. They could also both burn you and not even finish top 15 if the numbers repeat from last year. So the variance you're going to get from him is arguably wider than any other player in fantasy football. Number 1 at the position as opposed to number 17 is a massive gap in overall production. But maybe you're a believer in Deshaun Watson having a bounce back season this year, but personally, I am not. I'd probably have more excitement for Njoku if you told me that Deshaun gets injured again and now Jameis Winston is his quarterback for the majority of snaps. If Winston is known for anything, it's his willingness to chuck it deep. No matter what the coverage is, Njoku can be triple teamed and Winston says, fuck it, he's down there somewhere. On the other hand, if Deshaun Watson is known for anything, it would be harassing massage therapists and not playing in games despite the fact that the doctor clears him to play. So I'm kind of at a loss when trying to rank Njoku, but I've settled on him at number 10. You could tell me that I'm 5 spots too low, and I understand. I could also look back and tell you I was 5 spots too high. It is hard to pin him down overall, but I think he is a much better target to draft than Kyle Pitts. I view them almost the same this year because his price is so much cheaper. Njoku's ADP is tight end 11, pick 101 overall. He's going 5 picks behind Brock Bowers, and I'd much rather draft him than the rookie in Vegas. I'm perfectly comfortable with his ADP. I actually draft him quite a bit, especially if I miss out on Ferguson or an earlier tight end, I think you are drafting him at his floor, essentially, with the potential of that league-winning upside. If I have to settle on Njoku as my tight end 1, I'm still pretty ecstatic with how my team turns out. I will take my chances after pick 100. But compared to Kyle Pitts, who's going off the board at pick 60, it is night and day. Give me Njoku over Pitts every day of the week. So that's it for this video. These are my top 10 tight ends at the position. I have 5 players in the top tier. Any of these guys I think can finish number 1 overall at the position. I have LaPorta, Kelce, Dalton Kincaid, Mark Andrews, and Trey McBride at the top. Then I have a tier of 3 players, George Kittle, Evan Engram, and Jake Ferguson, followed by 2 wild cards in Kyle Pitts and Njoku in a tier of their own. So that's it for this video. I'll hit you with the next 10 later on next week, and then I'll pivot to quarterbacks and update all of my rankings once we have a lot more definitive training camp reports to pin down what to expect from these guys. But that's it for me in this video. My name is Adam Riancho, and hit that like button for me if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.